Right now, it's not clear whether Europe will even have a seat at the table when the war against our country ends. And we see how much influence China has on Russia, and we are deeply grateful to Europe for all the support it's given our country during this war. But will President Trump listen to Europe? Or will he negotiate with Russia and China without Europe?
Wow. So President Trump, who's now in his second day in office, he's been talking really since, 2023, actually, is as far back when he was started the campaign. He was saying he was going to have this war over in a day and all this kind of stuff, and always talking about negotiated settlement. And Zelensky's tried to put a good face on it, even as recently as just yesterday. But just about 4 hours ago in Davos, I think he's kind of saying, you know what? Pound sand, that ain't going to work. And so he's starting to go a little bit more towards saying, hey, Europe, maybe you and I need to get this figured out on our own. Welcome back, Matt Ho. Hadn't had you back on since the new year tripped over. Been missing you, man. But for those who may not know, this is Matthew Ho, currently the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network, former highly decorated combat veteran from the United States Marine Corps. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Danny. Yeah, I haven't seen you yet this year, so Happy New Year.
Same to you. Same to you. No, glad we all made it through.
Yeah, and now here we go.
Go there in 24 for a while. So, but we made it to another one, and we're starting off, in high gear here in this first part of the year. But I kind of wonder what your thoughts were, because just in the last 24 hours, there's been a pretty meaningful change in at least the public rhetoric from Zelensky. We actually, when we were getting ready for this show, we had initially planned on using something different, where he tried. I want to say it was last night. Was just saying, hey, yeah, I'm working with Trump. He's a strong guy, and we're going to negotiate a peace through strength. And then now at Davos a few hours ago, he seems to be changing his tone. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I had not seen that this morning. Been distracted, I think, with inauguration as well as the ceasefire in Gaza and the opening of operations. What looks like the opening of the annexation of the West Bank by Israel. But certainly this rift between Europe and the U.S. That existed between during the first Trump administration. It's not a surprise that it's back open again. And Zelensky's, I think, playing to those in the European political circles who had hitched their wagon to Ukraine and feel that if Ukraine goes down, we'll go down. And so it's trying to ensure that he's got a relationship that he can benefit from with political leaders in Germany, France, Britain, etc., who have been with him all this time and whose identities now are very much tied to Ukraine, even as it came at the cost of great economic harm to their own constituencies. Certainly, as you said, Danny, Trump had said he'd solve the Ukraine-Russian war in a day. So as we were saying before we came on, he's 3 hours late. I think there were some comments he made regarding Ukraine and Russia last night in the Oval Office. Comments I think people are taken as his desire for ending the war in Ukraine is not a priority. I think the realization of how difficult things are going to be to end the war is something that has set on to his team. But I think you haven't seen any dismissal of Keith Kellogg yet, right? So the idea that the Trump is still looking towards finding a solution to the war, although the rhetoric, the bravado, the confidence that it's going to be over and done with as soon as he comes into office obviously is gone. Zelensky, of course, is trying to position himself to survive, maybe with the fear that, and maybe Zelensky, Danny, understands that if Trump or the U.S. fails to get a negotiated settlement to Ukraine, that will not be what many thought. What would then occur would not be just a continuation of the war with the U.S. support, but maybe Trump would actually walk away, would have the U.S. walk away from that. So is this Zelensky, trying to ensure that he's got support post U.S. departure from the conflict, But it's all dusty. It's all murky. It's all we're really not sure what the Trump administration's going to do. Or we shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that because they haven't dismissed Kellogg. Kellogg still has the purpose of going there, trying to end this thing. We'll see.
In case anybody had missed any of those comments, there was a couple of different ones that Trump made last night that were making a lot of the rounds. This one, it got a little bit less notice until just here recently, and maybe the more noteworthy, especially for today's comments.
Plan to speak with President Putin soon. What about Zelensky, and what's your message?
Yeah, I would, but he's told me he wants to make a deal. Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia by not making a deal. I think Russia's going to be in big trouble. You take a look at their economy. You take a look at the inflation in Russia. So I would hope. I got along with him great, and I would hope he wants to make a deal.
If you're accusing Trump of not being real focused on this, that seems to be a lot of validation right there, because it's like, I don't know, he wants a deal, I guess. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't.
There's not the usual Trump confidence, right? The usual bluster, the usual, I'm going to do this and get it done. It was, he seems to be willing to take it either way. There'll be a deal or there won't be a deal. I think then the issue is going to be, is it going to be U.S. continued support for Ukraine if there's no deal, or does the U.S. depart from it? And as Zelensky, obviously, as we were just saying, hedging for that potentiality. The fact that he's so openly performing this way, Zelensky, speaking these things, makes me think that that's what's been communicated to him from the Americans, is that, look, if we don't get a deal, we're going to walk. So maybe there is that threat there, but certainly the Kellogg plan, that was introduced over the summer, that is the framework that we have to assume is what the United States is going to try and enter into negotiations with. In the Kellogg plan, to remind people, Keith Kellogg, retired Army general, had been Mike Pence's national security advisor. He put forward a plan over the summer, essentially saying, this is how we're going to end the war in Ukraine, or how we can end the war in Ukraine. We'll freeze the lines as they are. We'll freeze the front line as it is. The United States will continue to provide military support for Ukraine going forward as a guarantor. But then this issue of Ukraine joining NATO will be pushed off for 10 or 15 or 20 years, right? So that's the framework that we have to assume that they're still going to be presenting to the Russians. I don't see the Russians accepting any of those three aspects. But we have to see in the coming weeks whether this plays out, whether there'll be a Rubio-Lavrov meeting followed by a Putin-Trump summit. I mean, those are the types of things that would need to occur for this negotiation to be in place. And a couple of weeks ago, Keith Kellogg said it would take him about 100 days to get this done, which is a pretty short period of time. So if that's their belief that we can do this in 100 days, or maybe 100 days is the max amount of time I've been given to get it done, that could be a way to look at it as well. Then they'll have to start doing things rather quickly.
And okay, so we've shown you a bit of the Davos commentary. There's more to come, and Trump's just kind of laissez-faire commentary. But in that statement, he mentioned both that, both Zelensky and Putin want a deal done. So we've shown you part of Zelensky. But now here's what Putin said yesterday.
We're also open for dialogue with the new U.S. administration on the Ukrainian conflict. The most important thing here is to eliminate the fundamental reason for the conflict. That's the most important. And as for settling the situation itself, its goal should be not a brief ceasefire, not just getting some time to regroup and rearm and carry on the conflict, but long-term peace based on respect to lawful interests of all people and nationalities living in the region. And of course, we're going to fight for the interests of Russia and its people. This is actually the goal and point of the special military operation.
So when he says that it has to not just have a ceasefire, that's already dismissing the first point of the Kellogg plan.
Right.
But he said it wants to get to the underlying causes of this war, which was NATO on the border. That would seem to eliminate point 2 on the Kellogg plan.
Right.
And then he says he wants to have some kind of an equitable deal that looks for everyone's security, which would include Russia's. Now, so it's 0 for 3 so far.
Exactly.
They haven't even gotten to meet. But I think the last thing he said there was, I think, a bigger tell on the Russian side. And I just want your view on this. When he specified that we are fighting for the Russian people and our territory. And because he considers all of the people in those four annexed territories with Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia, etc., he considers those Russian people. But even when you look at the map, even more of that, they also consider Odessa and Kharkiv City as Russian cities as well. And is he signaling that our negotiations may be all of that to the Russian side, or we'll just keep fighting? How do you see it?
Well, hopefully, if that's the case, Danny, in that idea of Kharkiv and Odessa in a larger, expanded territorial grab by the Russians, is, what's the saying about negotiations? You don't go in asking for a half a loaf, right? So hopefully that's a starting point. It's not a precondition. That's what I worry about with the Americans, as you know this, Danny, right? So many of our attempts at negotiations over the last decades haven't been negotiations at all. It's basically been a holdup, right? Basically, you're going to accept our preconditions as the outcome of the negotiations, and that's it. That's certainly how we approach things over and over and over again, whether it was with the Afghan Taliban, whether with the Iranians, how we present ourselves to China, right? I mean, so this type of American way of negotiating that fails, particularly when the other side has the upper hand. I think, one way we've looked at this Russian war has been as a war that Russia started to prevent a war they didn't want. Right. So the idea being is that we need to begin this war in Ukraine to prevent a larger war that we see inevitably with NATO down the road. And I think the idea of the Russians having achieved those objectives, or to get to that goal, requires not just the idea that Ukraine doesn't become a NATO member, but that Ukraine becomes neutral. And in one of the slides, Gary, you put up, you had on a subheading that Zelensky's asking for 200,000 European peacekeepers in Ukraine, which of course that's a non-starter. So if President Trump is saying, look, Zelensky wants a plan, Putin wants a plan, these folks, they're entirely split from each other, entirely divorced from one another in terms of what they're openly saying. Now we do know that there are more and more Ukrainians as the months go on willing to give up territory for peace, which is unfortunately for the Ukrainians, I think, what's going to happen. And everyone needs to remember that at least in the first 6 or 8 months of Russia's invasion, territorial acquisition was not part of their stated goals, right? I mean, there was no desire in February 2022 for the Russians to take territory, hold it, let alone annex it and have it become part of Russia.
And by the way, I just thought I'd jump in on that point, because that is so important for everybody to understand that as of the Istanbul talks that we've mentioned a number of times, part of the result of that would have ended up with a Russian withdrawal of all their troops back out, as long as they had the provisions for the security of the Russian speakers in the East, and they had autonomy and all that kind of stuff, very much like the Minsk agreements were supposed to have been. Right. That was what they were agreeing to then. Now then, that's off the table.
Yeah, and I think what you've seen with the Russians certainly has been a good faith effort prior to February 2022 to negotiate, a good faith effort. And I think you're with me, Danny, that the whole point of the Russian invasion, particularly what I would call a feint, onto Kyiv, was to secure negotiations, because negotiations began within 2 days. If your goal was to conquer the entire country, why are you beginning negotiations when you haven't even conquered really anything at that point, or very little? So, so you had that attempt as well. You could call what occurs with the Russians prior to 2022, desperate, good faith, whatever. They are attempting to negotiate with us. We refuted them. Then, of course, you have the invasion, negotiations that again were refuted by the West. I had just seen, I don't know if you saw this, Danny, I just saw it, but in December, a Swiss diplomat who had been the Swiss ambassador to Turkey, has gone on the record and said, "Oh yeah, everything that Naftali Bennett and Gerhard Schroeder and all these other folks have said about the Americans and the Brits stopping the Istanbul agreements is true." So we just continue to see more and more people going on record saying, yes, this war could have ended in April 2022. However, the Brits and the Americans intervened because they saw this war as useful in denigrating and weakening Russia with this fantastical hope that somehow would bring about regime change.
By the way, related, I don't know if you saw it in the New York Times. I want to say it was 3 days ago now. There was a revelation that aside from what happened in Istanbul, later that same year in November of 2022, I think you and I have talked about this, probably the best chance that Ukraine would ever have had to negotiate an end from a position of relative strength was November 2022, after they had just driven the Russians out of Kherson, driven them out of a large part of the Kharkiv region. They had just mobilized, so they were still at a very weakened point. And Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, came out and publicly said, I'm just saying this would be a really good time to negotiate. The Russians are weak, the Ukraine side. I'm just saying this would be a good time. Well, it turns out New York Times said that it was the Secretary of State Blinken that sabotaged that this time. And I had not heard that until just a couple of days ago, but it wasn't just that Biden didn't take it. It was that Blinken said no. And my God, look at the cost that is going to be eventually rendered on your Ukraine because we refuse to do that, because the deal that we'll get, whatever it turns out now, will be infinitely worse than what we could have had in November.
Oh, absolutely. It just even on Sunday, and this is part of what happens, right, Danny, at the end of any administration. Now, all of a sudden, the corporate media, the mainstream media grows a pair, if you will, and they start writing these types of stories, right? So we saw on Sunday as well, Time Magazine interview with Eric Green, who was a member of the National Security Council under Biden, saying, "Oh yeah, no, all along we never thought that Ukraine could defeat Russia militarily. We never thought that Ukraine would be able to expel Russia from its territory. That's why we always spoke vaguely, and that's why we never put any definitions on things." And so now not just you're seeing the media having the courage to talk about things that again were understood 26, 27 months ago, but you're also now seeing kind of the rats fleeing the ship. Right, again with Afghanistan, with Iraq, with Vietnam. After it's all said and done, now all of a sudden all these guys start saying, "Well, I didn't believe it. I didn't think it was going to work. I told them they shouldn't do it." So we're going to see more people like Eric Green, now saying, "Oh, I never believed in this. It was never going to work," et cetera, as well as to this reporting that look, it wasn't just some staffer or two guys doing a StreamYard interview talking about this back in the fall of 2022. It was the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The senior military advisor of the President of the United States saying, "Look, Mr. President, this is the best it's ever going to get. Let's take it." Because at that time they were in a position of relative strength versus the Russians. The Russians hadn't fully called up all that mobilization yet. It only been a month or so after the Russians had said that we're going to annex these 4 oblasts, so the Russians easily could have walked away from that as well too. Now at this point, they can't walk away from any of that, and they've got an army that is stronger than it was a couple of years ago, an industrial capacity that is really needs to be respected. There are issues in Russia, such as inflation, but and they always the ever-present concern that an overheating war economy will eventually implode. There's always that danger, but it doesn't seem as if the Russians have structured their economy and their industries to be in real danger of that. And certainly the Russian people are behind it. The Russian people, according to public opinion polls, will accept the negotiated settlement, but they're not going to surrender, and they're not going to be pressured from the outside to do anything they don't want to do. And certainly Putin, President Putin, is as popular as he's ever been. I mean, so you look at just the let alone the horror, right? The moral disgrace that Tony Blinken is. As a strategist, he is incredibly incompetent. And I'll say the same for Jake Sullivan, and I'll give Joe Biden the pass because he's senile, right? But look at Joe Biden's record. What did Bob Gates say about Biden? He's the only person I've ever met in my life who's the only person I've ever met in my life who's been wrong about everything. I think that's what Kate said about him, So, but, not just the morality of this, the horror show that we've witnessed in Ukraine, also, of course, in Palestine, but the strategic ineptitude, the incompetence here, the fact that these people couldn't see past their own egos, couldn't see past their own ideological blinders, who are so wedded to the imperialist vision that they have, their obligations as officers of the empire to either maintain or expand the empire, to defeat any opposition that pops its head up, whatever it is, wherever it is, that they couldn't realize that this is the reality of the situation here, and this is how it's going to go unless we end it now. And of course, that now we're in this position where Trump has come into office, and I think they're realizing that this is, we're not in a position of power. We don't have the leverage we think we have. All we can really do at this point is put leverage on Ukraine. What's the leverage that's going to be put on Russia? We're going to sanction you more. We're going to go from 25,000 sanctions against you to 26,000 sanctions against you. What we're going to do, we're going to send more weapons to Ukraine. Oh, wait, we don't have those weapons to send to Ukraine. So like the leverage that we have, the Trump administration has going into this with Russia, it's not really there. The only thing that Americans can really do to threaten the Russians at this point, besides maybe throw some carrots and, hey, we'll rescind sanctions and we'll be better partners with you and everything else, have a better relationship with you, is this idea that, look, we'll add $4 or $5 trillion to our national debt to defeat you. That's really the only.
Well, that'll get there.
And we'll do that. We'll do that. We'll do that.
Please don't put yourself in more debt for us. So there's a couple of other factors I want to talk about before I get back over to the Zelensky comments, because I think it puts them in sharper relief that might make things make a little bit more sense. Is that aside from all the factors that you just mentioned about leverage and the absence thereof, on the Russian side, there's two things. One on the Russian side and one on the Ukraine side. On the Russian side, within just the last 4 or 5 days, you had the Minister of Defense, Belousov, and their national security advisor, Patrushev, have both said that there is a plan in place, both personnel, logistics, equipment, everything that they need to win the war in 2025. All of these things that President Putin has laid out before with the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and the Zaporizhia regions, all of those territories, even the ones that the Ukraine currently still has under their possession, all of that will be gone. There will be no NATO, et cetera. So they said they have a plan to win this. Patrushev said the same thing, his national security advisor. That's what the Russians are saying. On the other side, you have Sersky, for the first time I've ever seen publicly announce that, oh, by the way, we can't even replace our losses anymore. So if you see the Russian side, and they are still a net gain, and by the way, in case anybody's not clear on this, there was also a German general that came out and said, hey, Russia is probably building up their forces for a potential future clash against NATO, because they're building more tanks, more drones, more production. Their supplies are growing, their depots are growing, everything's getting bigger while Ukraine is getting smaller. So when you hear the Russians say that they have a plan in 2025 to win, you hear Western senior officials confirm that they do have the capacity to do that. Yep. Where is the leverage for anyone in the West to make Russia do anything they don't want to?
As well as the track that we're on. This idea that Russia is building out its military, it's building more tanks, more missiles, et cetera, not to win in Ukraine, but as a German officer said, to fight NATO. And this is something that the Russians believe that they're going to have to do. So the idea of getting us off this track, getting away from that, de-escalating this thing is as important and as much as paramount as ever. I'm not entirely certain what the Russians mean by when they said they'll win. I certainly feel that overall this was a strategic error for Russia, because now they're stuck, right? So even if they do in the next year, which at the rate they're on, it's going to take them the rest of the year to take fully take those four oblasts. What then? What then? Even if they push the Ukrainians, whether in a organized retreat or a complete rout and collapse, back all the way across the river. So back to Dnieper from the south all the way to the north, and literally that the Russians are, on the other side of Kyiv. What does that accomplish? That doesn't end the war, right? Even if they take Kyiv, the Ukrainians will relocate to Western Ukraine, and this, of course, will be the great purpose, the great mission that NATO wants and needs to sustain itself. If you have members of NATO, people in Brussels, as well as politicians and throughout Europe, who are in agreement with the idea that the Europeans need to spend more on defense. Trump said 5%, but then he said 3.5% maybe. But if you want to really get there, the idea is that we have to do that because look, the Russians have now taken half of Ukraine, right? And so you see this idea of like what could victory possibly look like for the Russians. And so I think the Russians will accept the negotiated settlement that gives them what they want and what they need, but only if it gives them what they want and what they need. And I'll tell you this too, Danny, because I was in Ireland back in December, and you make some friends over there, and you see people. A friend I made, she was telling me she was at a Christmas party, and she was talking to Irish diplomats, and these Irish diplomats, stating that Ireland needs to join NATO, right? That this mania exists that we can't, throughout a country who has staked its role in the world on its neutrality. A well-founded, well-earned, well-respected neutrality, even though as it abuses at time by, say, like allowing American military aircraft to use Irish airfields. But the idea being that the Irish are even saying, Irish diplomats are even saying, it's embarrassing for us that other people are defending us, right? So the greater success Russia has on the ground in Ukraine, the more it creates strategic and political problems for them, let alone the fact that the farther west they move, they're moving into more Ukrainian-speaking territory, which gives the issues of an insurgency. And if people remember, go back 3 years, that's what the Americans were rooting for. There are plenty of articles that were written late 22, early 23 about how the Americans would love to see the Russians go into Ukraine so that they can repeat Afghanistan. No one less than Secretary Clinton is on record of saying this. And we actually have now, we know that the Biden administration started sending more weapons to Ukraine in the fall of 21 to prepare for that. Right. So now for the Russians, you're looking at, are we walking into something that we're not going to be able to walk out of? So there is the desire for Russia to negotiate there's benefits to come from that for them. Yeah. But at the same time, they're not going to surrender. Right. And they're not going to give up this war, right? Because if they give up this war, that means they are putting themselves at risk for a war in the future that they don't want. And I wish people would understand that that's how the Russians are viewing it. You don't have to take Russia's side. You can do as I do and call them what they're doing, violation of international law, war crimes, everything else. Same time, too, you understand why they're doing that. But and hopefully this is what the Trump administration will come to, that understanding that, look, either we figure something out, we force the Ukrainians to give in to the Russians, to give the Russians what they want. 10, 20 years from now, we'll see then about what happens with those parts of Russia that are these newly incorporated parts of Russia. Maybe they're given back to Ukraine, who knows, but at least stop the escalation and stop this war before it goes into something And
so I want to take a look now. That's down the line a little bit. I want to look at where we are, like literally today, the second day of Trump's administration. And I'm thinking that there's some plausible evidence to suggest that what you said at the top of the show here may well be right, that perhaps the Trump team is privately signaling to the Zelensky team that, hey, we're not going to fight for you. You're not going to get a great deal. It's just not that important to us, because there's a significant change from Zelensky's public statements from last night until 4 hours ago. And this one here, the next piece we're going to play is he's talking about our place, meaning us, Ukraine and Europe. And he's saying, hey, we ain't going to play second fiddle to nobody. Watch this.
And their representatives of the United States delegation openly said their top security priority is the Indo-Pacific region. The second is the Middle East and the Gulf. And only the third is Europe. And that was under the previous administration. And will President Trump even notice Europe? Does he see NATO as necessary? And will he respect EU institutions? Ladies and gentlemen, Europe can't afford to be second or third in line for its allies. If that happens, the world will start moving forward without Europe. And that's a wall that will not be comfortable or beneficial for all Europeans. Europe needs to compete for the top spot in priorities, alliances, and technological development. And we are at yet another turning point.
So, just first of all, let's whether that did or didn't happen in terms of communications behind the scenes. How do you think this statement, where Zelensky is basically saying, "Hey, we're not even on Trump's radar here, so it's just you and me, and we're not going to be third place to." How is Trump going to be taking that?
I think he's accurate. I think Zelensky's what he's saying is accurate. I mean, I wouldn't even think they're not even third place. If you go back and you look at his inauguration address yesterday, which was incredibly important because it had its elements of Trumpism, isn't it, right? You know, and God save me to make America great again. He had all that usual bluster and nonsense and Trumpisms in it. But it also was very serious, though, too, in terms of this is what we're doing. And he didn't mention, as far as I remember, he didn't say the word. He didn't say Russia. He didn't say Ukraine.
Right, not one time.
I don't think he said Europe at all. Right.
No.
The closest you came in his inaugural address is when he spoke about how nations will no longer have a free ride. Right. How we are not going to continue to pony up for other nations when they're not paying their fair share. That was the closest you got to a reference to Russia, to Europe, because that's, of course, who he's referring to. This goes back to his first administration, the fights he got into with the Europeans, Angela Merkel and others over how much the Russians are, how much the Europeans are spending on their defense. But, you look at his priorities, the Trump administration's priorities, and you see it is China. It is the Middle East. And it is, of course, something that was very clear, I thought, in his speech yesterday, whether he was connecting it to the immigration crisis or to national security issues. It was Central and South America. I think Central and South America was going to have a very, very high-profile role in the Trump administration, whether it be with Mexico, whether it be with Venezuela, whether it be with Cuba, whether it be just throughout the region. We'll just look at the fact that Trump put Rubio in charge of the State Department. When you hear Rubio's name, you don't think about Europe. You don't think about China necessarily. You don't really even think about the Middle East. But within Rubio, it is focused southwards. It is focused towards Latin America. And there's going to be a large emphasis by the Trump administration on Latin America. He spoke about Mexico. He spoke about Panama, and he spent more time talking about Panama in the inauguration address than he did talking about Israel and Palestine. Now, that, of course, was Israel-Palestine was saved for later if people didn't see the spectacle at the Capital One Arena where they had some marching bands and some other things. But, I think maybe a lot of people had thought, if you only watched the inaugural address, you'd think, like as I did, well, that's weird. He barely talked about Israel and Palestine. Again, he talked more about Panama than he did about Israel, Palestine. What was the sense of this whole big ceasefire? When is Trump going to take the credit? This is the dissonance that was occurring as I was watching this was very real. What's going on here? How come Trump's not taking credit for being, the man who brought peace to the Holy Land? And, then later on, you watch the event at the Capital One Arena, and that was the whole showcase, the centerpiece, with the hostage families that they brought up on the stage. They stood at the backdrop for Trump for 40 minutes or so as he made his remarks. They stood still there.
Okay, I want to get to that in just a second, because that's actually we're gonna shift gears to that area in just a second.
But the point being,
I'm not even familiar with that.
Europe is not on the radar. Yeah.
Okay, so now then, maybe he's reading the tea leaves as much as being told behind the scenes. But in this last clip here with Zelensky, he's now saying that he's looking for security guarantees from Europe.
Finally, Europe must be able to guarantee peace and security for everybody, for itself, and for others, for those in the world who matter to Europe. Europe deserves to be strong, and for this, Europe needs the EU and NATO. Is this possible without Ukraine and without a just end to Russia's war against Ukraine? I'm certain the answer is no. Only real security guarantees for us will serve as real security guarantees for everyone in Europe. And we must ensure that America also sees us as essential. For that to happen, America's focus must shift to Europe so that one day in Washington, they will say, all eyes on Europe.
Okay, well, I'm going to hit the last part in a second. But first of all, I want to move back a little bit earlier in his comment there. Let's just think about this from the European perspective. I think maybe a lot of that up to this point, we're going, yeah, he is. We're not going to be third place to nobody. They're not even thinking about us. Yeah, we should. And then all of a sudden he's like, I want security guarantees from Europe. Now, that implies almost by definition that everybody else in Europe must risk going to war against Russia on behalf of Ukraine. How is that message going to be received?
Well, the reality of it is impossible, right? The European armies are hollowed out. The British Army has been as small as it's been since the 18th century. The British Army, you could fit the entire British Army in, Giant Stadium and still have like 10 or 15,000 seats left over. You know what I mean? Right? I mean, like that's the reality. And we've heard this about the German army. The German army is hollowed out. The French, and they've all talked about spending a lot more money on their militaries. You've seen that the French in particular, hundreds of billions of euros more they plan on spending on their military. France has wounds to lick as they've been kicked out of Africa. One nation after another kicked the French out. They've lost their empire there. Macron's comments over the last couple of years have been very aggressive. To go back to March, he had that plan coming out of France about sending in a 60,000 man European contingent into Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. You also have this idea that the EU has been more militarist over time. So the idea of the EU having their own standing military, their own standing army, adjacent to NATO, is something that has been spoken about for a while and is becoming more and more of a realized ideal. So there are those within Europe who are sympathetic to Zelensky, and I'll say I'm sympathetic to Zelensky to a degree, in the sense that he was promised things by the Americans, by the Brits. He was promised to be the next Churchill. He was promised you will receive everything you need. You will help you defeat this and win back your country. And again, you'll be this generation's Churchill. And of course, he didn't receive it. He was never going to receive it. So was he naive? Was he a fool? Was his ego so big that was his greed so big that put him in his place? Yes. But he also is someone whose desperation is coming from the fact that he has been let down, to put it politely, by the Americans, the Brits, and others. And so he's throwing anything out there to keep himself in place, in power. But the idea that there are some Europeans who are receptive to what he's saying is clear, because we've seen them say such things. Now,
right. But there are those in Europe that are, but in terms of any government that exists right now, I don't see anybody that even contemplate actually giving an actual security guarantee, anything more than paper deep, that would potentially draw them into a conflict with Russia. So I think that's a complete dead on arrival. If he's thinking he's going to motivate Europe with that, I think he's wrong. The second thing I think he's wrong about, with his kind of another naive thought, there's the last part of that context, that clip, to where he says we have to make America put us back up on the list. Did you see anything either yesterday or today, and anything Trump has said, that's going to make you think that Vladimir Zelensky is going to be able to talk Trump into putting Europe up number one?
No, I mean, absolutely not. Trump is, he's the emperor, and certainly something I've been saying more and more is that to understand the decisions of our presidents, you should replace the title president with emperor, and maybe the decision makes more sense. But Trump certainly is an imperialist. Look, he's a space imperialist. He's talking about planting the American flag on Mars. So like he is the empire. He takes his obligations very seriously. But I think he views the American empire in the same way he views the real estate empire. His own wealth, his own development, his own empire. And so he sees it in the way of what makes sense for him and what makes sense to grow his empire in the way he wants. And he sees Europe as old and decayed and not worth the investment, right? That I'm not going to get a return on investment in Europe that I'll get in Asia, that I'll get in Latin America, that I'll get in the Middle East, right? That he doesn't see the benefit accruing both for himself and both for the empire at large.
Okay, so on that in that line, the thinking then, what is the risk that Trump listens to that speech today and says, okay, you want Europe to give you security guarantees, and they're definitely not going to do it. You want me to put you up number one, I'm not going to do it. So right. What am I negotiating with? Now, if he's going to go in and talk to Putin, I think the first clip we showed you in the cold open there was him saying, we might not even have a seat at the table, meaning Europe right. or him. And now the likelihood is it's going to be Trump and Putin that are going to make these decisions. And that's the most realistic emperor-like case that you can make.
Right.
So the question is going to be, is Trump now going to go, okay, dude, if that's your position, then I'll just make whatever deal I can with Putin to get this off my plate so I can pay attention to things that are higher on my priority list.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. He doesn't want this occupying his desk. He doesn't want this taking up time. You know, he doesn't want this as an issue that he has to put any resources into more than he wants. And again, he doesn't see Europe as, remember, go back 20 some odd years and the whole issue where Europe is not supporting the American invasion of Iraq. And Dick Cheney made this big statement about how, no, you're talking about the old Europe, Europe, right? And I'm talking about the new Europe. You know, at this point, I think as Trump sees it, he sees Europe just as maybe he likes Hungary, he likes Slovakia, he likes these other nations that like him back, you know, like that type of thing. But overall, he doesn't see the benefit of prioritizing Europe. He sees them as hangers-on. He sees them as countries that have lived off of American success, and it's time to cut them loose. So I think that type of the point then being right is going in to negotiate with Putin. Then what does he have? What does he have to say, I'm going to do this if you don't go along with what I'm offering as a negotiated solution? Not a heck of a lot. Not a heck of a lot, you know?
So in that sense, do you think that this move was yet another desperation by Zelensky trying to play big, but may end up even backfiring?
I think so. I think also too, Zelensky, recall, and this is not anything that's just, it is new either. If you remember, Danny, back in the summer, you had Boris Johnson making those comments about how how Ukraine could replace the United States in NATO. There was some conference that Boris Johnson was at, and he said, like, if the Americans leave, right, they can be backfilled by the Ukrainians. As well as for the better part of these 3 years, you've heard this discussion about turning Ukraine into the arms factory for Europe, or the arms factory for democracy, the arsenal of democracy, right, to recycle that term. I mean, so there's this belief that within European circles that have favored this war, that need this war because their whole identity is now bound up in it, that somehow Ukraine can be turned into this war machine that can be utilized for their purposes. Because there are those who are in Europe who are very militarist, who are very much imbued with the idea of not just being under the American wing, but being equal or maybe even surpassing the Americans. I think some of them have this idea that the United States is in decline, certainly is, and that Europe could then move past the Americans, not just move out from under the American umbrella or under the American empire, but be their own weight in the world, right? Have the role in the world that Europe should have. And so you have these as well. So you've been there. You go to London, you go to Copenhagen, you go to wherever, and you see the statues to the old admirals and everything. So there's that old reminiscence, that nostalgia for the empires they once were, for the countries that they used to be, that used to matter, you know? So I think there's a lot of that too. And they see Ukraine as the opportunity to do that. And they see Ukraine as a tool or the mechanism that they can do that. And they're just continuing on with what's being done. Hey, in order for us to have this type of primacy, in order for us to matter, in order for us to be on the same level as Russia and China and the Americans, we need to be able to have military force. And our military force will be those Ukrainian boys that haven't yet been thrown into the furnace of war. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's going to work out very well because they don't seem to be doing math much either. But Anyway, we'll see how that develops, and we're certainly going to keep a close eye on that.
Yeah. I will say I do believe that the Ukrainians can hold, though, as long as the money comes in. So I do believe that, and we could get off this show, Danny, and the Ukrainian army could be in collapse right now for all we know. But I think if the money continues to come in, if a half generation of young men are put into the military, they lower the draft age, they start to execute things smarter, which that's a long reach for the Ukrainian generals, I think. But, they start to consolidate, they start to entrench themselves, they move back, they give up terrain, they enter into a much more, they figure out a way to defend in depth in a way that they haven't been able to do so, that they can hold on. As long as the money
I certainly hope they don't, because that will also drag it out and make sure more of them die unnecessarily, because it won't change the outcome any. So I certainly hope that isn't how it goes.
Yeah, I think that the whole and I think they have this belief that they're going to produce 2-3 million drones a year, and the drones are going to be the things that keep the Russians from actually substantially progressing on the ground. That our drones will prevent the Russians from putting their armor and their mechanized units on the road, and that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that will hold the Russians off. I think they have that belief, and maybe there's something to it. I don't know, but I do have a fear
Russians
that
have drones too, and electronic warfare. So I don't think that's going to play out well.